few months ago to speak this fall at Westside on the book, The New Jim Crow. My intent was to provide context for understanding the Black Lives Matter phenomenon, the latest expression of the movement for freedom and equality that African Americans have carried on for generations. But digging into our country's racial history also turns out to be timely in the wake of the election of a wild card candidate to lead our nation. If you were like me, you hoped the racially charged rhetoric of Donald Trump's campaign would not actually coalesce into policy once he takes the Oval Office. Alas, our president-elect has already made several appointments signaling that white nationalism will find an ongoing place in his administration. Not exactly reassuring to those of us who promote and affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. You can consider today's service an invitation to continue or to join in this work. When I read The New Jim Crow about 3 years ago, my husband William and I were starting to talk about where we might be willing to move after I completed my ministerial training. I was painfully aware of how differently I thought about this question of where I might be comfortable living compared to earlier in my life when I was single and white. Well, still white, obviously. Because my soulmate, as most of you know, is African American, and we have a sweet daughter. She was 3 in this picture, who by the age of 2 had already come to identify herself as brown like daddy. I wanted to go where my family could be safe and happy. Over the last several years, a story upon story of unarmed Black people killed by police poured in from every part of the country. I eventually concluded that everywhere had the potential to be a Ferguson, Missouri. There is no safe place for people of color. During our initial conversations, I also found myself shying away from big cities, places where many Black and brown people had been limited in where they might live. Limited by widespread discrimination in the housing market and by deliberate concentration of poor people of color in government housing projects in the inner city. Instinctively, I feared places where other people might mistake my husband, my child, for a member of the urban underclass, might see them as a threat, regardless of the reality. As happened to Trayvon Martin and the child, Tamir Rice, and we could keep naming those names for the entire rest of this service. So I had a conundrum. How could I practice solidarity with all people, and how could I teach my child to do so if I was busy keeping her away from marginalized groups? I began to wonder if there was kind of a hidden classism seeping out of me. But it actually has a lot to do with some developments in our nation that until that time, I had been sleepwalking right through. During the heyday of the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. told the graduating class at Oberlin College, "There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution." Michelle Alexander describes her own awakening in her landmark book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. It might seem surprising that Alexander was slow to recognize the larger pattern of our age. She was not only an African American legal scholar, but a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer and advocate. How could such a person not see what was right under her nose? But as I read her book, I found myself waking up too. Now, I thought I already knew a lot about racial justice before this. I had studied gender, race, and class as a graduate student in sociology 15, 20 years before, and felt like the scales had fallen from my eyes at that time. I joined a racial justice task force at my UU church, and for 7 years helped lead our efforts in our congregation and community. Some years later, my commitment ratcheted up another level when I fell in love with a Black man, married him, and became a mother. Now my hope, my fear, my anger, and my determination when it comes to issues of race and equality in our country are inseparable from what William calls the mama bear part of me. I tell you all this because there are people here who have read a lot, even showed up for Black Lives Matter rallies, maybe people here who were involved in earlier iterations of the civil rights movement. And there may be people in this room with firsthand experience on the receiving end of racism and ethnic prejudice, a kind of lived experience that I will never have. So I just want to let you know that I was not naive when I cracked open the new Jim Crow. And if you're in that position too, it does not necessarily mean that what is contained between its pages will read to you like the same old stuff. It's startling. And it remains just as timely now, not more so, than when I first opened this powerful book. And there are two big things that I hope you will remember a week or a year from now. First is the scope and impact of mass incarceration, and second, the racial politics that underpin it. Alexander outlines the problem in these terms. In less than 30 years, the U.S. penal population exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million, with drug convictions accounting for the majority of the increase. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of nearly every developed country, even surpassing those of highly repressive regimes like Russia, China, and Iran. But there's more. The racial dimension of mass incarceration is its most striking feature, Alexander goes on. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did during apartheid. In major cities racked by the drug war, as many as 80% of young African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These young men are part of a growing undercast, she says, permanently locked up and locked out of mainstream society. So that's the scope. But why did this happen? It's not because crime was up. Crime was declining at the start of this trend. And the preponderance of black and brown people in our prisons cannot be explained by different rates of drug crime. People of all races use and sell drugs at similar rates. White youth are actually the most likely to engage in drug crime. So what is going on? This is what really kind of cracked it open for me. It shocked me. Which probably tells you something about my privilege to be shocked. But you see, there was a deliberate decision made by some of our leaders to depict black men as criminals. To create a dehumanizing stereotype without saying so directly. It was done to appeal to white voters who were scared by the changes that the civil rights movement was bringing. They fanned the flames of fear for their own political gain. Sounds all too familiar, doesn't it? Such leaders in the 60s and 70s gave lip service to the goal of racial equality, but actively resisted desegregation, busing, and civil rights enforcement. This is when conservatives began framing welfare as a wedge issue between poor whites, who were depicted as hardworking, and poor blacks, painted as lazy and undeserving. Richard Nixon was the first to use the rhetoric of the war on drugs, but it was Ronald Reagan who mastered the new strategy. Reagan's colorblind rhetoric on crime, welfare, taxes, and states' rights was designed to appeal to disaffected white voters, while providing the plausible deniability that race was what they were really talking about. It was no longer publicly acceptable to call out for segregation forever, but people could still speak in praise of law and order. I was a child of the 80s, so there's much that I remember about this era, particularly the war on drugs that Reagan made real in that decade. It might surprise you to learn that the public did not consider street drugs a problem before Reagan unveiled the war on drugs. To get the funding to scale up the war on drugs and fulfill the race-based campaign promises that were implicit in that war, his administration realized they needed to sell Congress and the broader public on the need for this war. They needed support not just from those spooked by the civil rights movement, but from a majority. They got it via a media campaign, which through images and stories associated black men with criminal activity. They went straight to fear, playing on our human instincts of self-protection. Fast forward to 2016, and it feels not so different. We've elected a candidate who played the same game, for example, painting all Mexicans as rapists and criminals. Now, it's important to know that inner cities were hit particularly hard by the deindustrialization that were taking place then, and crack became a problem during this vulnerable time, just a couple years after the war on drugs was unveiled. Crack cocaine is actually no more harmful and was no more prevalent in black communities than the rise of powder cocaine use was among white Americans. But to people like Reagan, the spread of crack in inner cities was an opportunity. They seized upon it, and the media responded. Thousands of stories about the crack crisis flooded the airwaves and newsstands, Alexander writes, and the stories had a clear racial subtext, featuring black crack whores, crack babies, gangbangers, drug kingpins. Do you remember this? I remember this. This is what built sufficient support for the war on drugs. This was a taxpayer-funded propaganda campaign to criminalize African Americans. Over the 80s and 90s, we saw the get tough on crime line of thinking turn into a competition among politicians of all stripes to prove who was tougher. George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton both fell in line with this new norm of being tough on crime, so it wasn't an issue of political party, including sustaining a war on drugs that has not by any measure been effective in reducing drug use. The war on drugs has been effective at what its original boosters designed it to do. Keep black and brown people down, and keep poor people of all colors from coming together across color lines to challenge the economic status quo. This divide and conquer strategy is nothing new in our country. It's what led European elites in the so-called New World on this continent to turn from the use of indentured servants for cheap labor. Indentured servants included many Europeans as well as Africans, to the use of chattel slavery instead, reserving that harsher, more permanent source of labor solely for Africans. So white supremacy helped rationalize first the horrible treatment of Native Americans, and you kind of see echoes of that going on now at Standing Rock, and later the enslavement of Africans, but it was economically motivated. Poor whites eventually accepted this racial bribe. Instead of banding together with poor folks of all colors, as they had done on a number of occasions before, to the alarm of the planter class, poor whites accepted the rather meager reward of a less miserable existence than slaves and the psychological boost of feeling racially superior. The racial bribe worked again during segregation, the old Jim Crow, and it has worked again in this new Jim Crow era for a long time, keeping America physically and psychologically separated by race, helping to distract us from fundamental questions about our economic system and the inequality it produces. I would love to be proven wrong. I really would love to be proven wrong, but I suspect that many of the white Trump voters, I won't paint them all with a broad brush, but those who were attracted by the familiar ploy of scapegoating non-whites and non-Christians, I suspect that they will be disappointed with the results. If history repeats itself, then once again, this distraction at great cost to other groups will not really improve the economic position of poor and middle-class people, white or otherwise. Rather, it'll still be those at the top who further consolidate their economic and political power. Those voters vulnerable to the scapegoating appeals were just being used to further someone else's agenda. That's how that game works. But back to the 80s and 90s. The war on drugs didn't just win votes for law and order politicians. It reshaped our social order because that's what it was meant to do. The local law enforcement agencies initially resisted the imperatives of the federal war on drugs. The financial bribes and federal grants and equipment proved too compelling for them to pass up. Thus it is that forces that are supposed to keep us all safe have instead been deployed for what is effectively a war on poor communities of color. That's where the stop and frisk tactics are concentrated. That's where the SWAT teams with their military equipment go and traumatize families. That's where large numbers of families of children have fathers in prison. Fathers who land there largely through plea bargain, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Rather than providing a cheap source of labor to the economic elite, as slavery and Jim Crow segregation both did, the war on drugs has crippled the ability of millions of people, especially black and brown men, to gain employment at all. With the one exception that they are used as cheap labor while still in prison, although that's not why the system of mass incarceration was created. Discrimination against ex-felons is perfectly legal for employers, and it's widely practiced. If that weren't bad enough, those who have been through the criminal justice system can also be barred from housing assistance, food benefits, and student loans. They may be required to stay away from old friends and neighbors suspected of involvement with drugs too. If you have the misfortune of growing up in the hood, that basically means that you can't go home again. So where could you go? I look back to a few years ago when I volunteered regularly at a day shelter for the homeless, and it's not surprising that so many of the people there, black and white and Latino, had been in prison or on probation or parole. Homelessness is a logical outcome for already marginalized people who were put through the criminal justice system. In many states, felons are also barred from voting, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Even if the time in prison was short, even if the crime was minor, like possession of marijuana, an extremely common conviction, even if you were innocent and accepted a sentence as a plea bargain. If felons could vote, it might have changed the results of our 2000 presidential election. It's believed that if the 600,000 former felons of Florida at that time had been permitted to vote, Al Gore would have won instead of George W. Bush. In any case, Michelle Alexander makes a sobering point about how a disenfranchisement of felons distinguishes our nation on the world stage. She writes, "No other country in the world disenfranchises people who are released from prison in a manner even remotely resembling the United States. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has charged that the U.S. disenfranchisement policies violate international law. In some ways, this new Jim Crow is different than the old segregation, though. The reign of law and order has spawned a prison industrial complex upon which many poor rural communities are dependent now for jobs. And of course, there are many African Americans who are not caught in the system of mass incarceration. A racial profiling affects black and brown people in this country, no matter where they live or what their socioeconomic status is. After William and I got married and he moved from Indianapolis to Bloomington, where I was living at the time, which is a college town, he was annoyed, but not surprised, to be followed around Best Buy, one of his favorite haunts. For a year, every time he went in to buy equipment for his high-tech business, or just get his fix of the electronics atmosphere, they were watching him. And that was in a supposedly liberal university town. Similarly, the crime of DWB, driving while black or brown, is a concern regardless of social class. I had a classmate in seminary a few years ago named V, a black New Yorker who talked matter-of-factly about the driving lessons she gave her son when he was 16 at that time. She taught him where to put his hands if he was pulled over on the steering wheel, where the police could see them. And he knew what to do before the officer reached his car, activate the voice recorder on his phone, and that way if he was harassed by police, he would have evidence. Bea happens to be an attorney. Earlier in her career, before she went to seminary, she prosecuted criminal defendants as a district attorney, and she now runs a state agency in New York, so she has some insight about these things. She knew her son was at a much higher risk of getting pulled over and getting into trouble than most of the sons and daughters of this congregation. In fact, I touched base with her recently, and she told me that her son was a very talented cellist. Decided after graduation to move to California from New York and see if he could make it as a professional musician. And Bea felt like she needed to make that road trip with him for multiple reasons, but one of those was not letting her baby drive across the country by himself, and who knows what would happen. Still, the presence of a black middle class makes the new Jim Crow very different from the old. And images of exceptional African Americans, people like Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey, that blind us to the existence of a racist caste system in our day. There's also more collateral damage from mass incarceration than from the old Jim Crow, people harmed who were never its intended targets. Because the current caste system must be race neutral on its face, white people can get caught in it too. If you're white, you're far less likely to be targeted by law enforcement, and the discretion that is built in at every stage of the criminal justice system is likely to work in your favor. But the war on drugs has sent plenty of white folks, mostly poor white folks, to prison too. This system of mass incarceration that distinguishes our country among the so-called developed nations was racially motivated. It continues to have enormous consequences, most dramatically for people of color, but really for all of us, no matter where we live. And despite the dawning signs of progress that have come over the last several years of activism, when some politicians and funders were starting to listen, the work of dismantling the new Jim Crow has barely begun. Perhaps what we most need to realize about this racial caste system is that no overt or widespread racism is necessary for the system to replicate itself. We don't need a president who bandies about negative stereotypes about African Americans or Mexicans or Muslims to keep it going, although that has emboldened some people. All that is required to keep the system of mass incarceration going now is for good people to do nothing. To look the other way, right past the millions of people that are being warehoused, the millions of lives being wasted on our watch. All that is required is that we go back to sleep, even when the alarm goes off. And do you remember that discussion I let you in on at the beginning between me and my spouse about where we might move to? What became clearer to me after reading Alexander's book is that my fear of taking my sweet brown child anywhere near big cities with ghettos reflected the messaging I had grown up with. Messages that brown people who live in such places are pitiful at best, dangerous at worst, and not worth saving. Who would want to put their child at risk of being treated that way? My fear made perfect sense. But beyond my fear, what I also feel is that my mama bear instinct is for every child. It's not just my child. And this is a resource that we all have. That fierce love of a mother or a father for the children. The protective instinct of a grandparent or an aunt or uncle. The wisdom and caring of a mentor is for all the children of our nation, is it not? All of them. The determination to protect them, to nurture them, to make it better for them, and to teach them how to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. So that with all the reason and conscience and compassion we have helped our children develop, their generation can do their part to create a more perfect union in these United States. That is what we are called to do, I believe. For we in this room, we do have power. We can make a difference. We hear it almost every Sunday at our moment of Unitarian Universalist history. We UUs have made a difference in the abolition of slavery, and women's suffrage, and the civil rights movement, and most recently, for gay and lesbian people, helping to turn the tide of public opinion toward respect and equal treatment. So here's what I'm inviting you to do. I appreciate you staying with me through this difficult material. I know it's not easy to take it in and to face this reality. If you haven't already, I invite you to get your hands on a copy of Michelle Alexander's brilliant book. Last I heard, Bob Van still had a couple of copies available. Oh, they're all done, okay. You can get it from bookstores, you can buy it online, it's available in the library, and we also have several members who have access to other library copies if financial means are an issue. There's so much more in the book than I could share with you today. And secondly, if you can, come participate in the book discussion series that we're going to be holding here on December 4th and 11th, the next 2 Sundays. You can do it either during the 10 o'clock time period with Adult Forum, or during the 11:30 time period with Adult Religious Education, both Sundays. Talking about it together is a really good way to process the issues in the new Jim Crow, to share with others, and to explore what we can do to be part of the revolution, part of the solution. So I invite you to wake up with me, to speak out and step up on behalf of all the profiled and plea bargained, all our disenfranchised and forgotten siblings and cousins in this unfinished experiment in democracy that we call the United States of America. May that day be far closer than it now appears, that day when we step out of the shadow of racial past for good and live as one people. Until that day comes, let us hold in our minds and hearts the image of what our nation can be, and let us remember the work that our ancestors are calling us to do. So may it be. Please rise in body or spirit and join me in singing our closing hymn. It's in your teal hymnal number 1018. Come and go with me to that land. Let's go to that land.